A day in the market. The bustling city market was alive with the hum of activity, an eclectic mix of sights, sounds, and smells that painted a vivid portrait of the community. Vendors called out to passersby, their voices competing over the vibrant symphony of the crowd. Aromas of spiced meats mingled with the sweetness of ripe mangoes and the tang of freshly squeezed citrus. Children darted between stalls, their laughter punctuating the air as they played an impromptu game of tag. Amid this chaos was Adele Simmons, a striking black woman in her early 40s. Her calm demeanor and elegant posture contrasted sharply with the energetic frenzy surrounding her. Adele's dark hair was swept back into a sleek bun, and her tailored navy suit, paired with low heels, spoke to her professional life. A leather satchel hung neatly on her shoulder, its polished brass buckle glinting in the afternoon sun. She was here not to shop but to observe, a quiet ritual she indulged in to unwind. Adele paused at a vendor's table, her eyes scanning a collection of antique books. She picked up one with a cracked leather cover, its gold-embossed title faded with age. Turning the pages gently, she smiled, finding solace in the familiar scent of aged paper. Two police officers stood nearby, leaning casually against a food cart. The older one, Sergeant Mitchell, was stocky and broad-shouldered, his thinning gray hair cropped short. He sipped coffee, his demeanor relaxed but watchful. Beside him was Officer Connors, a younger man in his late 20s, sharp-featured and restless, scrolling through his phone in between sweeping glances at the crowd. "Look at her," Connors muttered, nodding toward Adele. "Doesn't she seem out of place?" Mitchell glanced up, his gaze landing briefly on Adele. "She's just shopping," he said dismissively. Connors smirked. "Shopping in a suit like that? She's probably trying to blend in while doing something shady." Mitchell sighed, setting his coffee down. "You're too jumpy, kid. But fine, let's check it out." The officers approached Adele with measured steps, their presence deliberately assertive. Connors called out, "Excuse me, ma'am, can we have a word?" Adele looked up from her book, her expression composed but curious. "Yes. Can I help you?" Mitchell stepped forward. "We're conducting routine checks in the area. Can we see some identification?" Adele raised an eyebrow, her voice steady. "Routine checks. On what grounds?" Connors folded his arms, smirking. "You look suspicious. We just want to make sure everything's above board." Adele's calm exterior didn't waver, but her lips pressed together tightly. "Suspicious, you say? And what about me appears suspicious?" Mitchell bristled slightly at her tone. "Look, ma'am, we're just doing our job. Show us some ID, and we'll be out of your way." Reluctantly, Adele reached into her satchel and retrieved her wallet. She handed over her driver's license, watching as Mitchell scrutinized it. "It checks out," Mitchell muttered, handing it back. Connors wasn't satisfied. "What's in the bag?" he asked, his tone smug. "Let's have a look, just to be sure." Adele's grip on her satchel tightened. "Unless you have reasonable suspicion that I've committed a crime, you have no grounds to search my belongings." Connors' smirk deepened. "Come on, lady, don't make this difficult. Just open the bag." Mitchell stepped closer, his patience thinning. "Let's not turn this into something it doesn't need to be. Show us the bag." As Adele opened her mouth to protest, Connors reached out, his hand brushing the strap of her satchel. Instinctively, she stepped back, her voice rising. "Do not touch me." The commotion began drawing attention. A few passersby slowed their steps, their curiosity piqued by the escalating tension. Connors' smirk faded into a scowl. "Oh, so now you're resisting," he said loudly, his voice meant to gather authority and an audience. "Resisting," Adele repeated, her voice sharp. "You're overstepping your authority. I've complied with your requests, and you have no justification for this harassment." Mitchell grabbed her arm, his grip firm. "Let's take this to the car," he said, pulling her toward their patrol vehicle. Her satchel slipped from her shoulder, landing on the ground with a thud. Adele's composure cracked, anger flashing in her eyes. "Unhand me immediately," she demanded, her voice cutting through the chatter of the growing crowd. "What are you doing?" "She hasn't done anything," a young man shouted, stepping forward from the onlookers. "You can't just grab someone like that," a woman with a shopping basket added, her voice indignant. Connors spoke into his radio, requesting backup. "We've got a suspect resisting arrest." "Suspect?" Adele exclaimed, incredulous. "Resisting arrest? This is an abuse of power." Connors sneered. "Abuse of power? You're not in court now, sweetheart." The murmurs of the crowd turned into a chorus of outrage. A man holding his phone aloft yelled, "I'm recording this. Everyone's going to see how you're treating her." "That's Judge Simmons," another voice called out. "You don't know who you're messing with." Connors froze, the smug confidence draining from his face. Mitchell's grip slackened, his eyes narrowing. "Judge?" he repeated. "Yes," Adele said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing around her. "I am Judge Adele Simmons, and what you're doing right now is illegal." The crowd's outrage swelled, their voices rising in unison. Phones were aimed at the officers, their cameras capturing every moment. Somewhere in the distance, the wail of approaching sirens grew louder. The market, once a lively hub of commerce, had become the epicenter of a brewing scandal, a fractured authority. The blare of sirens grew louder, their wailing cutting through the market's cacophony. The crowd shifted nervously, forming a loose semicircle around Adele and the officers. Tension hung heavy in the air, thick enough to choke. What had started as an unjust confrontation was rapidly spiraling into a full-blown spectacle. Sergeant Mitchell's grip on Adele's arm faltered, though he hadn't yet released her. His jaw tightened as he processed the claim she'd just made. "Judge." The word echoed in his mind, clashing with his assumptions about the woman he'd just manhandled. Next to him, Officer Connors stood frozen, his face pale, as if someone had doused him with ice water. "Is this true?" Mitchell asked Adele, his voice lower but still carrying an edge. "Yes, it's true," Adele replied, her voice steady but laced with fury. Her piercing gaze bore into him, unyielding. "I am Judge Adele Simmons of the 4th District Court, and unless you want this to become the career-ending mistake of your life, you'll let me go right now." Mitchell's eyes darted toward Connors, who offered no support, just a wide-eyed stare that betrayed his growing panic. The sergeant straightened, his hand dropping from Adele's arm, but he made no move to apologize. Instead, he barked, "We'll sort this out once backup gets here." The murmurs of the crowd grew louder. "This is outrageous," an older woman shouted, clutching a tote bag filled with vegetables. "You're treating a judge like a common criminal." "You're done for," a teenager called out, his phone raised high, capturing every second. "This is gonna blow up online." "Enough," Mitchell snapped, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. The crowd wasn't backing down, their indignation feeding on itself, growing stronger with every passing second. Adele took a step forward, her posture commanding. "You have no grounds to detain me, and your actions are unlawful. You've already escalated this situation far beyond what your duties require. Release my belongings and step aside." Mitchell hesitated, but before he could respond, the sirens reached their peak, and 2 additional patrol cars pulled up to the edge of the market. Uniformed officers stepped out quickly, their eyes scanning the scene. Among them was Captain Daniels, a man whose presence radiated authority. His sharp features and graying temples gave him a look of seasoned competence, and the gold insignia on his uniform marked him as the ranking officer on the scene. Daniels approached the group with brisk strides, his gaze sweeping over Adele, the officers, and the agitated crowd. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his tone sharp enough to silence the murmurs. Mitchell stiffened, visibly uncomfortable. "Sir, we were conducting routine checks when this woman refused to cooperate and resisted our questioning. We're trying to verify her identity." Daniels' eyes narrowed. He turned to Adele, who stood tall despite the ordeal, her professional demeanor intact. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Daniels. May I ask for your side of the story?" Adele's tone was calm but unyielding. "Your officers accosted me without cause, demanded my identification, and attempted to search my belongings without a warrant. When I asserted my rights, they accused me of resisting arrest and physically restrained me. I informed them of my position as a judge, yet they continued to treat me with blatant disrespect." Daniels's gaze flicked to Mitchell and Connors. "Is this true?" Mitchell shifted uncomfortably. "We didn't know she was a judge, sir." She refused to comply. She complied fully. A voice interrupted from the crowd. It was the man who'd been recording on his phone. He stepped forward, holding his device high. "I've got it all on video." She showed her ID, and they still harassed her. Daniel's expression darkened. "Is that so?" Another voice chimed in, this time a young woman holding a baby. They didn't care who she was. They just saw her as a target. The captain turned back to Adele, his tone softening. "Judge Simmons, do you have proof of your identity on you?" Without hesitation, Adele reached into her jacket pocket and produced her judicial ID, a sleek card bearing her name, photo, and official seal. Daniels took it, his eyes scanning the details before he nodded solemnly. "She's exactly who she says she is," he confirmed, his voice cutting through the thick tension. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of vindication and outrage. "Then why is she still standing here like a criminal?" someone called out. Daniels handed the ID back to Adele, his expression grim. "Judge Simmons, I apologize on behalf of my officers. This situation should never have escalated to this point." Adele's gaze didn't waver. "Captain, your apology is noted, but the damage has already been done. Your officers violated not only my rights but the trust this community places in law enforcement." Daniels looked toward Mitchell and Connors, his voice like steel. "You two, explain yourselves." "Now." Connors stammered, the bravado he'd displayed earlier completely evaporated. We thought she was acting suspicious. We were just trying to do our jobs." Mitchell's voice was steadier, but no less defensive. "We had no way of knowing she was a judge. We were just following protocol." "Protocol?" Adele interjected, her voice cutting through like a blade. "Protocol does not include racial profiling or unwarranted harassment. Your actions were based entirely on assumptions and biases, not evidence or probable cause." The crowd erupted into applause, their support for Adele overwhelming. Connors looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. Daniels raised a hand to quiet the crowd. "Enough. Both of you, step aside and wait by the car. We'll discuss this later." As the two officers slunk away, Adele adjusted her jacket, her composure intact despite the ordeal. She addressed Daniels directly. "Captain, this isn't just about me. This is about a culture within your department that allows this kind of behavior to persist. I expect a full investigation." Daniels nodded solemnly. "You have my word, Judge Simmons. We'll get to the bottom of this." But Adele wasn't finished. She turned to the crowd, her voice carrying over their murmurs. "This moment is bigger than any one person. What happened here today is a symptom of a deeper issue that we must confront together. Accountability is the first step, but real change requires all of us to demand better." The crowd erupted into cheers, their support swelling into a chorus of approval. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the market, Adele stood at the center of it all, a beacon of dignity and strength. The incident that had begun with humiliation and injustice was now transforming into a rallying cry for change. A spark ignites. The evening sky bold into rich hues of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows over the marketplace. But the energy in the square was anything but tranquil. A storm of emotions, anger, solidarity, and determination, coursed through the gathered crowd, which had grown larger with each passing minute. Smartphones were raised like torches, their cameras capturing every angle of the confrontation that had unfolded. Adele Simmons stood at the epicenter, her posture a blend of dignity and defiance, as murmurs of outrage rippled through the throng. Across from her, Captain Daniels struggled to maintain control of the situation. He was a seasoned officer who had seen his share of high-pressure scenarios, but this was unlike anything he had faced before. The marketplace, once a hub of commerce and chatter, had become a crucible for social justice, its participants demanding accountability in real time. Daniel sighed deeply, the weight of responsibility pressing heavily on his shoulders. He turned to Adele, who stood flanked by supportive bystanders. "Judge Simmons," he began, his voice steady but tinged with weariness. "I understand your frustration, and I assure you, this will not go unaddressed. But I need your help to de-escalate this situation." Adele's gaze was unyielding. "De-escalation begins with accountability, Captain. The crowd isn't here because of me. They're here because they're tired of watching the same story play out, time and again. If you want their cooperation, start by showing them that justice applies to everyone, even your officers." Daniels glanced toward Sergeant Mitchell and Officer Connors, who stood near their patrol car like guilty schoolchildren awaiting a scolding. Connors fidgeted nervously, while Mitchell's stoic expression betrayed a flicker of unease. Daniels knew that diffusing this situation meant publicly addressing their actions, but the implications for his department loomed large. Before he could respond, a voice rang out from the crowd. "Why aren't they in handcuffs?" shouted a middle-aged man holding a toddler on his hip. "If it were one of us, we'd be arrested already." "Yeah," a woman yelled, raising a fist. Enough with the double standards. The crowd's energy surged, their chants growing louder. "Justice! Justice!" The word reverberated through the market, a rhythmic demand that sent chills down Daniels' spine. Adele raised a hand, signaling for quiet. Slowly, the noise ebbed, though the tension remained palpable. She turned back to Daniels, her voice calm but firm. "The people are speaking, Captain. What's your response?" Daniels hesitated, but only briefly. He stepped forward, his voice rising above the murmurs. "Sergeant Mitchell and Officer Connors," he called out, his tone commanding, "step forward." The two officers exchanged uneasy glances before approaching their superior. The crowd fell into a tense silence, their collective gaze fixed on the scene. Daniels addressed them directly. "Your actions today were inappropriate, unprofessional, and unacceptable. As officers of the law, you are expected to uphold justice, not undermine it through prejudice or abuse of authority." Connors opened his mouth to protest, but a sharp look from Daniels silenced him. Mitchell, meanwhile, remained stoic, though his clenched jaw betrayed his inner turmoil. "As of this moment," Daniels continued, "you are both relieved of duty pending a formal investigation. Turn in your badges and weapons." A ripple of astonishment swept through the crowd. Gasps, murmurs, and even a smattering of applause broke out as Daniels' words sank in. Mitchell and Connors stiffened, their faces flushed with humiliation. "This isn't right," Connors muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. Daniels shot him a warning glare. "Do not make this worse for yourself, officer." Reluctantly, the two men removed their badges and service weapons, handing them over to another officer who approached with a small evidence bag. The crowd watched in stunned silence, many raising their phones to capture the moment. Adele's expression remained impassive, though inwardly she felt a flicker of vindication. This was a step in the right direction, but it was far from sufficient. Daniels turned back to the crowd. "I understand that trust in law enforcement has been shaken today. I can't erase what happened, but I can promise you this. Our department will conduct a full and transparent investigation. Any wrongdoing will be met with appropriate consequences. You have my word." The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some nodded reluctantly, acknowledging the gesture, while others shouted demands for further action. "You think suspending them is enough?" a young woman yelled, her voice sharp with indignation. "What about charges? If they broke the law, they should face the same consequences as anyone else." "Yeah, "We've heard promises before," added an older man. "Let's see some real change, not just words." Daniels raised his hands, signaling for calm. "I understand your skepticism, and I don't blame you. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with moments like this. Hold us accountable, and I promise you, we will listen." Adele stepped forward, addressing both Daniels and the crowd. "Accountability is more than suspensions and promises, Captain. It's about acknowledging systemic failures and committing to meaningful reform. This moment isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has ever been silenced, dismissed, or mistreated because of the color of their skin or the assumptions made about them." The crowd erupted into cheers, their applause a thunderous affirmation of her words. Adele turned to face them fully, her voice rising above the noise. "We must stand together, not just today, but every day. Demand better, not just from law enforcement, but from every institution that claims to serve us. Change is a collective effort, and it starts now." As the applause swelled, Adele felt a swell of determination. This incident, while deeply personal, was a microcosm of a larger struggle. And though she hadn't planned to become the face of that struggle, she realized now that she had a responsibility to use her voice, not just for herself, but for the countless others who couldn't. As the crowd began to disperse, their energy transformed into a quiet resolve. Adele turned to Daniels one last time. "Captain, this is far from over. I'll be following up." Daniels nodded, his expression one of weary respect. "Understood, Judge Simmons. You have my word." Adele collected her belongings, her mind already racing with the steps she would take next. The marketplace, now bathed in the warm glow of streetlights, was quieting, but the fire ignited here would continue to burn. And Adele was determined to ensure that fire would light the way to change. The weight of the robe. Adele Simmons sat at her desk in her chambers, her hands folded neatly atop a stack of papers. The dim glow of the desk lamp illuminated the polished mahogany surface, casting soft shadows across her office. It was a stark contrast to the chaos of the marketplace just days earlier, but the tension within her remained just as potent. Outside her office window, the city bustled as if nothing had happened. Cars honked in the distance, their sounds mingling with the faint hum of construction equipment. Life went on, unbothered by the viral video that had thrust her into the public eye. Yet for Adele, the moment felt like a dividing line. There was the world before the marketplace incident, and the world after. Her phone buzzed incessantly, a constant reminder of how far the story had spread. News outlets, community leaders, and advocacy groups were all vying for her attention. Some wanted interviews, others wanted endorsements, and a few simply wanted her advice. Adele, however, hadn't responded to any of them. For now, she needed time to think. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, her voice steady. The door opened to reveal her clerk, Hannah, a young woman with bright eyes and a demeanor of quiet efficiency. "Judge Simmons," she began hesitantly, holding a tablet in her hands. "I know you said no interruptions, but I think you should see this." Adele raised an eyebrow, motioning for Hannah to step closer. The scales type. The courtroom was packed to the rafters. Rows of pew-like benches stretched toward the back of the room, filled with a restless audience of reporters, community leaders, activists, and everyday citizens. The air buzzed with anticipation, heavy with the unspoken weight of what was about to unfold. Judge Adele Simmons sat behind the towering oak bench, her expression calm but resolute. She was dressed in her judicial robes, the black fabric draped over her shoulders like armor. A week had passed since the marketplace incident, and its ripples had only grown larger. The video of her confrontation with the officers had gone viral, sparking protests, debates, and demands for justice across the city. Today was the hearing for Sergeant Mitchell and Officer Connors, who faced charges of misconduct and abuse of authority. It was an unprecedented case, the first of its kind to hold officers accountable so publicly in this district. For Adele, presiding over the case was not just a professional obligation. It was deeply personal. "Order in the court," the bailiff announced, his voice booming across the room. The murmurs in the crowd subsided, though the tension remained palpable. Adele scanned the room, her gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. On one side sat the officers' legal team, their expressions ranging from stoic to defensive. On the other, representatives from various civil rights organizations, their presence a reminder of the stakes at hand. The officers themselves sat at the defense table, their postures rigid. Connors looked nervous, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Mitchell, in contrast, appeared composed, though his jaw was set tight, and his hands clasped together betrayed the pressure he was under. Adele adjusted her glasses and began. "This court is now in session for the matter of People v. Mitchell and Connors. The defendants stand accused of misconduct, racial profiling, and abuse of authority during an incident that occurred at the city marketplace on the 17th of this month. Counsel, are you ready to proceed?" The defense attorney, a sharp-suited man named Greaves, rose to his feet. "Yes, Your Honor." The prosecutor, a woman with fierce determination in her eyes, followed suit. "Ready, Your Honor." Adele nodded. "Then let us begin with the opening statements." The prosecution wasted no time laying out its case. They described the officers' actions as a blatant abuse of power, driven by implicit bias and devoid of probable cause. They argued that the incident wasn't just a matter of poor judgment, but a symptom of a larger systemic issue within the police department. The defense, predictably, painted a different picture. Graves argued that the officers had been following standard procedure, acting in good faith to maintain public safety. He downplayed the significance of the officers' actions, framing them as minor lapses in judgment blown out of proportion by media sensationalism. Adele listened intently, her expression unreadable. She had spent her entire career navigating the complexities of the law, balancing the scales of justice with meticulous care. But today felt different. The weight of the role on her shoulders felt heavier, as if it carried not just the burden of the case, but the hopes and frustrations of an entire community. The evidence presented was damning. The prosecution played the now-famous video for the court, the footage captured by a bystander's phone. The room fell silent as the events of that day unfolded on the screen. The officers' demands, their dismissive tone, the physical restraint, and finally, Adele's calm but firm assertion of her rights. When the video ended, a murmur ran through the courtroom. Even Greaves looked uncomfortable, shifting slightly in his seat. The prosecutor turned toward the jury, her voice steady and impassioned. "This video speaks for itself. These officers, sworn to protect and serve, instead chose to intimidate, humiliate, and unlawfully detain a citizen, someone who, as a judge, has dedicated her life to upholding the very laws they violated. If this can happen to her, what does it mean for the rest of us?" Adele allowed the question to hang in the air for a moment before calling for a brief recess. During the break, Adele retreated to her chambers, where Hannah awaited her. The young clerk looked anxious, her fingers fidgeting with the edges of a file folder. "How are things going out there?" Hannah asked tentatively. Adele sighed, removing her glasses and rubbing the bridge of her nose. "It's tense. The evidence is clear, but justice isn't always about clarity. It's about courage. The courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult." Hannah nodded, her admiration for her boss evident. "Do you think the jury will see it that way?" "They'll see the truth," Adele replied. "What they choose to do with it is another matter." Back in the courtroom, the defense called its witnesses. Mitchell and Connors took the stand, each offering their version of events. They admitted to feeling uneasy about Adele's presence in the marketplace, citing vague concerns about public safety. But when pressed about what, specifically, had raised their suspicions, their answers faltered. Greaves attempted to shift the narrative, suggesting that Adele's refusal to comply had escalated the situation. But the prosecutor dismantled this argument with precision, pointing out that Adele had complied fully until her rights were violated. By the end of the day, the tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. The jury would deliberate overnight, their decision carrying implications far beyond this case. As Adele adjourned the session, she looked out at the crowd one last time. Their faces reflected a spectrum of emotions: hope, anger, skepticism, and determination. Outside, the media swarmed the courthouse steps, their cameras flashing like a staccato drumbeat. Adele stepped into the night, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She didn't know what the jury would decide, but she did know one thing. No matter the outcome, the fight for justice would continue, and she was ready to lead it. A verdict, a movement. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. It was the kind of quiet that felt almost sacred, charged with the energy of hundreds holding their breath. All eyes were on the jury box, where 12 individuals sat with expressions ranging from stoic to conflicted. After days of testimony, evidence, and emotional appeals, their decision was finally ready. Judge Adele Simmons sat at her bench, her hands clasped tightly before her. Despite her composed exterior, her heart beat heavily in her chest. She had recused herself from the deliberation process as both a witness and a victim, leaving the case to another presiding judge, but she had returned for the verdict. The bailiff called the court to order, and the alternate judge, a fair but stern woman named Justice Olivia Carter, took her place at the bench. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Justice Carter asked, her voice cutting through the tense air like a blade. The foreperson, a middle-aged man in a gray suit, stood. He held a slip of paper in his hands, his fingers trembling slightly. "Yes, Your Honor, we have." "Please hand it to the bailiff." The bailiff took the paper and passed it to Justice Carter, who unfolded it with deliberate care. The pause seemed to stretch into eternity, the weight of the moment bearing down on everyone present. Finally, she looked up, her face neutral. "In the case of People v. Mitchell and Connors, we find the defendants." She paused briefly, scanning the room. "Guilty on all counts." The silence shattered like glass. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed quickly by applause and cheers. Tears streamed down the faces of many, their relief and validation finally finding release. Adele exhaled slowly, her chest rising and falling as the tension left her body. She remained seated, her expression calm, but a faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Justice had prevailed. For now. Justice Carter rapped her gavel sharply, calling for order. "There will be no outbursts in this courtroom," she declared, though even she couldn't suppress a small smile of satisfaction. The defense attorneys slumped in their seats, their earlier confidence replaced by grim resignation. Mitchell and Connors, now convicted felons, sat motionless, their faces pale. "Sentencing will take place in 2 weeks," Justice Carter announced. "This court is adjourned." As the gavel fell for the final time, the crowd began to disperse, the noise carrying their jubilation into the hallways of the courthouse and beyond. Reporters scrambled to capture reactions, their cameras and microphones thrust toward anyone willing to speak. Outside the courthouse, a rally had formed. What had begun as a small group of supporters had swelled into a sea of people, activists holding signs, community members chanting slogans, and families standing in solidarity. The atmosphere was electric, a collective sense of triumph radiating through the crowd. Adele stepped out onto the courthouse steps, flanked by her clerk, Hannah, and a handful of close supporters. The crowd erupted into cheers at the sight of her, their chants echoing through the downtown streets. "Judge Simmons! Judge Simmons!" they shouted, their voices a symphony of gratitude and respect. Adele raised her hand, signaling for quiet. Gradually, the chants subsided, replaced by an expectant hush. She stepped up to a portable microphone that had been set up, her voice steady and clear as she began to speak. "Today is a victory," she said, her words carrying across the sea of faces. "Not just for me, but for every person who has ever been mistreated, dismissed, or dehumanized by those sworn to protect us. This verdict is proof that accountability is possible, that justice is not an unreachable ideal, but a reality we can achieve when we stand together. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers loud and unwavering. "But," she continued, her tone serious, "this is only the beginning. Real change doesn't happen in a courtroom alone. It happens in our homes, in our schools, in our police stations, and in our hearts. It requires constant vigilance, courage, and a commitment to fairness and equality." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "The officers who violated my rights are not just individuals. They are products of a system that must be reformed. We must demand better training, greater oversight, and policies that prioritize humanity over bias. And we must hold not just individuals but institutions accountable for their actions." As Adele spoke, she saw the faces of the crowd transform, from anger to determination, from frustration to hope. "I stand before you today, not just as a judge, but as a citizen of this community, as a Black woman who has faced prejudice, and as a human being who believes in the power of change. Let this moment inspire us to keep fighting, to keep pushing, to keep demanding justice for all." The crowd roared their approval, their cheers mingling with the sound of car horns and clapping hands. Cameras flashed, capturing the image of Adele standing tall against the backdrop of the courthouse, a symbol of resilience and hope. That night, Adele returned to her chambers, the events of the day still fresh in her mind. She sat at her desk, staring at the stack of letters and emails that had come flooding in. Messages of support, gratitude, and solidarity from people across the nation. Hannah entered quietly, carrying a small tray with tea. "Judge Simmons, you are incredible out there," she said, setting the tray down. Adele smiled warmly. "Thank you, Hannah. But this isn't about me. It's about what we can do together. This moment has to mean something." Hannah nodded. "It already does. You've inspired people, Judge. You've given them hope." Adele sipped her tea, the warmth spreading through her. "Hope is a powerful thing," she said softly. "But it's only the start. Now comes the hard part, turning hope into action." As the city outside her window began to quiet, Adele sat in her chambers, reflecting on the road ahead. The verdict was a victory, but it was also a reminder of how much work remained. And she was ready to face it, armed with the knowledge that one voice, when joined by many, could indeed change the world.